In fact, the increasing frequency and strength of storms like Milton and Helene may have some rethinking where they choose to live. In many areas, many thought once to be immune from natural disasters are more vulnerable to severe weather, and scientists do insist that climate change is a major factor in the rise of powerful storms and extreme conditions. Tulane professor Jesse Keenan is an expert on urban planning, and he joins us now to speak about this from Philly. We heard one gentleman say he's sick and tired of being sick and tired, but Florida, people would expect for there to be hurricanes. Talk to me about places where people have moved to avoid climate change, like the Carolinas, and how still it's showing to be susceptible.
Well, I think the best way to frame this is that we have sending zones and receiving zones. And there are places throughout the United States where people are bearing certainly the risk of loss or actual loss from storms, extreme events, wildfires, landslides, floods, you name it, but also the indirect financial costs and exposure, for instance, in the insurance market. These things are adding up, and they're placing a great deal of stress in a world where we already have tremendous burdens in terms of energy utility cost burdens, in terms of affordable housing cost burdens, and the like. So what we see is that climate is now one of many factors that are shaping how and where people make decisions, or that is, decisions about how and where they're going to move and where they're going to live. Now, I don't think people are as naive as to think that they can fully escape the impacts of climate change. That's an impossibility. Climate impacts are widespread all throughout the United States, particularly in the context of extreme flooding and the risk of extreme precipitation events. But that being said, there are places that are hit harder, more regularly, that have higher economic costs and stresses associated with them. In those places, as we would imagine, the Gulf Coast, Florida, the Carolina coast, they certainly are, in certain areas, we see an outmigration associated with this. Are these very large numbers? We don't really know. The evidence is a little uneven as to the exact quantity and speed and pace of this. But we do have, let's say, better empirical information and data that suggests that people are valuing more moderate, cooler, less humid climates, for instance. And they're definitely looking at places all throughout the United States where their insurance payments are less, their rent costs are less, and where they're not in an immediate flood zone, for instance.
Because based on some of the graphics we're showing and what you're saying, we know that people have moved to the Carolinas. They've moved to Texas from places like California. And in fact, Tampa was one of the fastest growing cities in the nation. So based on what you're saying about people seeking places where insurance rates may be lower, where should people be considering if they are trying to avoid the widespread effects of climate change? I know you said you can't avoid it completely.
Yeah, so most demographers, economists, and the like really think that most of the movement will be what we call intra-county or relatively local. People are essentially moving out of the most immediate high-risk hazard zones, but they're moving to places within a county or within a geography that's just comparatively lower risk. It's not low risk, it's not avoiding risk, but it's lower risk compared to where they're moving from. That is, if they can afford to move. Many people, of course, do not have that luxury or the financial capacity to move, and they end up, in many cases, being stuck in very high-risk areas. So it's a significant challenge. It's also worth noting that we have pretty good emerging data now that the era of Sunbelt migration is beginning to wane. Historically, people valued sunshine, they valued the climate, but we know that those are essentially statistically irrelevant considerations now. The Sunbelt largely has grown because of more affordable housing.
Right.
But as housing becomes more expensive, in part because of insurance in a place like Florida, the true value of moving to the Sunbelt is quickly waning.
Yeah, and I remember from my time, going to high school in Phoenix, that was a city that just seemed to grow decade on decade. So perhaps now that will shift. Jesse Keenan, great to have you speak with us on a day like this. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.